This is video lecture 1, which will focus on character, point of view, and plot. Characters are the heart of the story. Within the narratives, they are people we can love, hate, identify with, or perhaps not care about at all. Point of view affects the way we see and interpret the events. Plot, however, creates the events for us to interpret characters who are placed in a specific situation. We wait to see how they will act or react within those situations. And conflict is always introduced. Conflict is what drives the narrative forward and keeps us engaged. Two short stories, A and P by John Updike and Happy Endings by Margaret Atwood, illustrate various aspects of character, point of view, and plot. A and P is character-based. The plot takes all of perhaps 20 minutes. Very little happens within the story, but we get inside the mind of Sammy, and it's an interesting place to be. The way he sees the characters and events in the story affects how we see the characters and events in the story. We see him on what appears to be an average day until a small conflict arises. Suddenly he acts differently, and a situation presents itself that seems to initiate him into adulthood. Without an interesting narrator, though, who views others in a unique way, there wouldn't be much of a story. Character is key in A and P. Happy Endings, on the other hand, is plot-based. This is an example of something called metafiction. It refers to itself. It's fiction that is aware it is a story with a plot. The narrator actually points this out towards the end of the story. Within Happy Endings, there is very little character development. Instead, we are given these narrative options in which we see the dramatic structure, also called Freytag's pyramid, play out in each one. What the story is doing is ultimately making a point about endings, the endings that we want in stories, and the endings that are realistic. The characters are the people in the story. They are often, but not always, psychologically realistic. We are able to understand or recognize what the characters say, think, feel, and do. Throughout this section of the video lecture, I will be referring to everyday use and discussing the characters Mama, Maggie, Dee, as well as Hakima Barber. All of this information about characters connects to the character's spine, or the character's motivation, and this is something that is mentioned in Andrew Stanton's TED Talk. The reader needs to understand the reason behind a character's actions to get a character, or to understand a character, and believe or accept that character's behavior. The tension in the story develops as the reader waits to see how a character will act or react within a particular situation. Getting to know the characters. There's direct characterization and indirect characterization. With direct characterization, we have the narrator directly describing an aspect of a character's personality or appearance. We have this with Mama. She directly describes the way that Maggie walks, and she also directly describes Dee's personality. When she describes Maggie, she says, "This is the way my Maggie walks. She has been like this, chin on chest, eyes on ground, feet in shuffle, ever since the fire that burned the other house to the ground." When she's describing Dee and talking about her personality, Mama says, "Dee, though, she would always look anyone in the eye. Hesitation was no part of her nature." With direct characterization, there's very little work on the reader's part. The narrator is handing us an explanation of a character's personality trait or something about the way the character carries himself or herself. Indirect characterization, however, is revealed obviously indirectly. This is when an aspect of a character's personality is revealed through his or her actions, dialogue, or thoughts. Instead of the narrator just directly describing the character's personality, we need to infer what the character's personality is on our own. This following quote is from Everyday Use, and it's about Dee. "She gasped like a bee had stung her. 'Maggie can't appreciate these quilts,' she said. 'She'd probably be backward enough to put them to everyday use.'" Now, Mama here isn't describing Dee. All she's doing is telling us what Dee does and what Dee says. But based on this description, we can assume that Dee is dramatic and perhaps a little self-involved. We are left to make these assumptions about Dee on our own. In addition to characterization, how we get to know the characters, we are also introduced to different character types. There are round characters and flat characters. A round character is one who is well developed, a character that we know, or this is a character who is closely involved in and responsive to the action of the story. From the beginning, we see that Mama is a round character. We get to know who she is, we understand her as a mother, we know a lot about her education, and she even describes her appearance in detail. Throughout the story, we just get to know Mama more and more, particularly as we see the way that she interacts with her daughters. We also have flat characters. Flat characters are stereotypical and/or barely developed, but they're there for a reason. Hekima Barber is definitely a flat character in the short story Everyday Use. There's a quote from Mama describing Hekima Barber when she says, "Hekima Barber just stood there grinning, looking down on me like somebody inspecting a Model A car. Every once in a while, he and Dee sent eye signals over my head." Throughout the span of the story, he says and does very little. However, his actions and his appearance in the story are there for a reason. For one, he seems to mirror Dee and reinforce the way that she looks down on her mother and her sister. We can also see the way that he is dressed is similar to Dee, which gives us an indication that Dee has changed as a result of some kind of group that she's joined in college. There's evidence throughout the story that Dee has joined the Black Power movement, and Hekima Barber reinforces this. We also have characters who change. These are dynamic characters, and characters who stay essentially the same throughout the story, and these characters are static. We can see that Mama grows and changes during the course of the narrative, and we see this most clearly in the moment when she snatches the quilts away from Dee. When Mama does this, she describes it to the readers and said, "I did something I had never done before, hugged Maggie to me, then dragged her on into the room, snatched the quilts out of Miss Wangero's hands, and dumped them into Maggie's lap." We see in this moment that this is the first time that Mama has stood up to Dee, and it's these quilts where we can see that Dee doesn't truly appreciate the history behind them that forces Mama to change, and Maggie recognizes that. We also have static characters, and these are characters who remain essentially unchanged throughout the narrative. Many readers argue that Dee is a static character. At the end of the short story, Dee says to Mama and Maggie that they don't understand their heritage. And then she says, "You ought to try to make something of yourself too, Maggie. It's really a new day for us, but from the way you and Mama still live, you'd never know it." Even though Dee seems to express appreciation for these everyday items within the household, she doesn't seem to truly respect Mama and Maggie, and she indicates that she looks down on the way that Mama and Maggie live their lives, even though they seem perfectly content to do so. So throughout the course of the story, Mama appears to be dynamic while Dee appears to be static. Point of view has a significant impact on how we view and interpret the characters and events in a story. With first-person point of view, we see the actions and dialogue of the other characters from the perspective of a narrator. We see personal pronouns like I, me, my, or we, us, and our, and we are limited to details from that character's experience. Everyday Use is a short story that's told in first-person point of view. Now, if this story had been told from Dee's perspective, we would get a very different story, but because it's told from Mama's perspective, we interpret the events and the other characters in a very specific way. There's also third-person point of view. With third-person point of view, we will always have a narrator who is outside the events of the story. Third-person objective tells a story from an objective point of view. The narrator remains entirely out of the characters' minds and reports just the actions and dialogue of the characters in the story. Third-person limited omniscient is limited to the thoughts, feelings, and observations of one character. So while we can see what the other characters are doing and saying, we're only given access to one character's mind. Third-person omniscient, however, opens it up even more. Third-person omniscient has an all-knowing narrator outside of the events of the story who's able to move freely from one character's mind to another. This narrator is not limited to one character's experiences and observations. And so we're given access to all of the characters' emotions and internal thoughts at some point in the story. A first-person narrator may seem to be reliable, particularly since he or she was directly involved in the actions of the story. However, we're sometimes given an unreliable narrator who misrepresents events and misleads readers either intentionally or unintentionally. A great example of an unreliable narrator is the narrator in The Telltale Heart. This short story is by Edgar Allan Poe. And at the very beginning of the short story, the narrator tries to convince the reader that he or she is sane. As the story continues, however, the reader quickly realizes that the narrator is insane, as the narrator is hearing things and has come up with this plan to murder the old man who he lives with. Even though we're getting the story from his perspective, we can't necessarily trust what that narrator has to say. So you do have to be careful with what kind of narrator you're dealing with and make sure that what the narrator is telling you in the story is what is actually happening. While characters are important and significantly influence the way that we see and interpret the events in a story, there wouldn't be a story without plot. The main question here is, does the story sound familiar? When you look at different stories, many times depending on the genre or the type of story, we see the narrative structure play out in the same way. Many times we know what to expect from a story because we've seen versions of that story before. Two great examples of this are horror stories and romance stories. With the horror story, especially when you're looking at Hollywood, we have an exposition where a group of friends, usually younger, leave to go on a trip in a remote location. From that point, we can pretty much guess what's going to happen. Usually there's a gas station when they're on the way to the remote location, and there's some kind of warning that happens at that gas station. A warning that tells them, turn back, don't go to that location, save your lives. Once they get to the remote location, something seems off. There might be a spooky room, there might be an attic, or there might be a basement that contains odd or scary objects. Eventually, they lose communication with the outside world. Phones stop working, that kind of thing. From that point, people start to disappear. Usually, they get whittled down until there's one left. In the climax of the story, the one character left standing faces off with the villain. This villain might be supernatural or might be a human being. In that moment, we're not sure if the character is going to survive or not, but usually that character does survive. In the following action, we see that the character survives and escapes, and then we have some kind of resolution. We might see that character in the hospital, being rescued by the police. We might see that character back home, and that character is somewhere in the normal world. Now, if this is a Hollywood film and they want to make more money, they'll leave it open-ended, and we'll see that the villain hasn't actually died. Even though we know how the story is going to go, they continue to come up with these stories. Hollywood continues to produce these stories, writers continue to write these stories, and there's a reason for that. The same thing happens with romance stories. With a romance story, we begin with a boy or a girl who's alone for any number of reasons. It might have been a breakup, that person might be a widow, an outcast, etc. When we get to the rising action, that person meets a love interest. And then the two begin to develop a relationship and they seem happy. However, shortly after the happy scene, we see that some kind of conflict comes in. It might be that the family doesn't like the person, there could be an ex, there could be secrets that they're keeping from each other, maybe the children don't like the person, there could be commitment issues, etc. And then the couple splits up. The climax comes at the moment when the couple is deciding to make it work or to call it quits for good. Usually they decide to make it work. With the following action, we see the moments right after the reunion, and with the resolution, we see a happy ending. If it's a film, we might see a montage of events that happen after this reunion. So we might see the marriage, them developing a family, the house that they move into. And if it's a book, the book might jump forward in the narrative to the future so that we can see how this couple's lives have turned out. The point here is that we've seen this story many, many times, and yet both of these genres continue to be incredibly popular, both in the world of literature and in the world of Hollywood. Let's just do a quick refresher of the different parts of the story. We have the exposition, which is the opening of the narrative. And we get these questions answered. Who are the characters? Where is the story located? When is the story taking place? And what is the situation? Then we get the rising action. These are the points in the plot when the narrative becomes more complicated and we're introduced to the conflict. Finally, we reach the climax. This is the point of greatest tension or emotional intensity in a plot. It is the point at which conflict reaches its greatest height and the crisis or turning point in the action occurs. Sometimes climax is used to signify multiple minor emotional peaks in the plot, whereas crisis is reserved to refer to the single point in which the protagonist's fortune changes decisively for better or worse. The falling action is the portion of the plot that follows the climax or the crisis, and this leads to and culminates in the resolution of the plot. And then finally, we have the resolution, or the denouement, which is a French word, and this is the culmination of a fictional plot that provides closure for the reader and the audience. So does this story sound familiar? We have this narrative structure that we see repeated over and over again. There's a researcher named Paul Zak who has shown that narrative structure, Freytag's pyramid specifically, actually changes the way we think and behave. Narrative structure activates our theory of mind, which is our ability to identify with other people's emotions. Because he was looking at neuroscience and the neuroscience of stories specifically, he decided to put this to the test, and he did research on it. When he conducted his experiment, he gathered together a group of people and he gave all of them money. What he wanted to see at the end of his experiment was how many people would donate money after they'd been shown different versions of a story. The first version of the story was about a father and his dying son. And within this story, we can see the emotions of the father as he watches his son play. Paul Zak had this version of the story play out in terms of narrative structure. There was an exposition, a rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. And that was the first group who witnessed that story. The second group, however, were shown the father and son just walking in the park. There was no narrative structure. It was just a father and his son spending time together. At the end of the research, at the end of the experiment, the group that was shown the version of the story with narrative structure was much more likely to donate money to an organization that helped with the illness that the son was struggling with. The group that watched the version without narrative structure, however, was much less likely to donate money or even donate any money at all. The research conducted in the last 10 years on the connection between neuroscience and stories shows how important narrative structure is. And it also explains why, even though we've seen a version of a story before, there's something in that narrative structure that activates that theory of mind and gets us emotionally engaged in the story. It's what makes us care about the characters and makes us care about what might happen to the characters as the plot progresses. As you are reading these pieces of short fiction, pay attention to the way that character types, point of view, and plot affect the way that you interpret the characters and the events in the story that you're reading.